I'm Alex, I'm 38, and my parents laughed when I told them they broke my heart. They didn't just miss my wedding. They treated my pain like it was the punchline to a bad joke, something to be smirked at over a cup of afternoon tea. Before I tell you how I found the strength to turn their casual cruelty into my life's greatest liberation, do me a favor and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It means a lot to know I'm not just talking into a void. The beginning of the end happened on a gray Tuesday afternoon, a full 2 months after my wedding. I was sitting in their formal living room, a place I'd always associated with the scent of lemon polish and the feeling of being slightly out of place. Nothing had changed. The cream-colored sofas were still pristine. The family photos on the mahogany mantelpiece were still perfectly arranged, and I was still the ghost at their feast. I had driven 2 hours to be there, stewing in a mix of hope and dread, thinking that a face-to-face conversation could somehow bridge the canyon between us. I had practiced this moment in my head 100 times on the drive over. I promised myself I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to plead. I just needed an answer to the question that had been eating me alive. Why? I asked, and my voice was quieter than I wanted, almost swallowed by the high ceilings of the room. I just need to know why you didn't come. My mother, Diana, was the first to react. She performed a slow, deliberate ritual of placing her teacup back on its saucer without making a sound. Her eyes, the same eyes I saw in my own reflection, wouldn't meet mine. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shrug. "Oh, you know how things get, Alex. It was such a whirlwind. Sam was in town, and it was just a truly lovely day for a barbecue. We haven't had the whole family together like that in ages." The whole family. The phrase was a perfectly polished stone, thrown directly at me. It wasn't an oversight. It was a statement. I was not, and had never been, a part of that equation. I turned my gaze to my father. Richard was looking right at me, and there was a smirk playing on his lips. This was a man who navigated the world with a compass pointed toward money, status, and power. My wedding, a deeply emotional, heartfelt ceremony celebrating my love for another man, was a landmark that didn't even appear on his map. "Come on, son," he chuckled, a dry, grating sound. "Don't be so damn sensitive. We had our priorities that day. You'll understand when you have a real family one day." He said it, just like that, a real family. He didn't just invalidate my marriage. He invalidated my entire existence. He implied the life I was building, the man I loved, the joy I had finally found, was all some kind of cheap imitation. That was the moment. It wasn't a crack. It was a seismic shift. The ground didn't just fall out from under me. It rearranged itself into a new landscape. All the years of desperate, aching hope, of trying to contort myself into a shape they would find acceptable, of begging for the emotional scraps from their table. It all turned to dust and blew away in that single cruel sentence. I didn't fight back. I didn't defend myself. I simply stood up. The movement was so sudden it made the teacup on my mother's saucer rattle. My father's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing with confusion. They were armed for a battle of tears or anger. They were utterly unprepared for my silence. "Thank you," I said, and my voice was chillingly calm, felt like it belonged to someone else. "Now I understand. Perfectly." I turned and walked out of that house, leaving them sitting in a cloud of their own polished indifference. They had no idea that their casual dismissal wasn't the final blow in a long war. It was my declaration of independence. They thought they had finally put me in my place, but what they had really done was hand me the key to my own cage. I was about to use it, and I would never, ever look back. To really understand why that moment was a liberation, you have to understand the 30 years of history that led up to it. My childhood home wasn't a home. It was a museum, and my younger brother, Sam, was the main exhibit. Sam, the football hero. Sam, the homecoming king. Sam, the son who was a perfect, shining reflection of my father's ambitions. His trophies weren't just on the mantelpiece. They had their own custom-built shelving unit in the family room. Gold, silver, bronze, a glittering testament to his physical prowess. His team photos, framed in expensive wood, lined the hallway like portraits of royalty. His achievements were the headlines at every family dinner. My achievements? They were the footnotes if they were mentioned at all. I wasn't an athlete. I was a reader, a writer. I found my refuge in the quiet worlds I could build with words, trying to make sense of my own feelings by giving them to fictional characters. I'll never forget the day I was 17. I won second place in a prestigious national short story competition. For a quiet, nerdy kid from the suburbs, this was the Olympics. It was the first external validation that the worlds I was creating in my head had any value. I remember my hands shaking when I opened the envelope. I ran home, clutching the certificate and a letter from the judges, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found my father in his home office on the phone, closing some business deal. I waited patiently outside the door until he was done. When he emerged, I held out the certificate. "Dad, look, I won. Second place in the whole country." He took it from me, his eyes scanning it with the same detached interest he might give to a piece of junk mail. The American Prose Foundation. That's nice, Alex. Very nice." He handed it back to me and clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to feel supportive but felt entirely dismissive. "Listen, I'm glad you have your hobbies. Now, speaking of winning, Sam's got his final game of the season on Friday. The scout from Notre Dame is going to be there. It's huge. We're all going, of course. You should try to make it." And that was it. My national award, the biggest achievement of my young life, was demoted to a hobby and used as a clumsy segue back to the endless saga of Sam. I didn't protest. I just nodded, folded the certificate carefully, went up to my room, and slid it into the back of a desk drawer, behind old report cards and forgotten sketches. It lay there for years, a silent testament to my designated place in the family hierarchy. The cruelty wasn't in overt meanness. It was in the soul-crushing indifference. I was the static between their favorite radio stations. It wasn't just my parents. The whole ecosystem of our lives was built around Sam. I remember my junior year, I had a girlfriend named Chloe. She was smart, funny, and one of the few people who actually asked to read my stories. I brought her home for dinner one night, a terrifying rite of passage. She tried so hard. She asked my father about his work, complimented my mother on the food. Then she turned to me. "Alex was just telling me he started a literary magazine at school," she said, smiling at me. "I think that's so incredible." My mother smiled politely. "Oh, that's one of Alex's little projects. He's always tinkering with something." Then she turned to Sam. "Sam, dear, tell Chloe about the summer leadership program the coach recommended for you." For the rest of the dinner, I watched Chloe's bright enthusiasm slowly dim as the conversation was relentlessly steered back to Sam's summer plans, Sam's training regimen, Sam's scholarship prospects. I drove her home in silence. When we parked in front of her house, she turned to me and said, "They don't see you at all, do they?" It was a simple question, but hearing it from someone else made it devastatingly real. We broke up a few weeks later. My best friend, Marcus, saw it all up close. His dad was our family doctor, so Marcus was a fixture in our house. He was loyal and fierce and was constantly trying to run interference for me. "Mr. Mitchell, did you know Alex got a poem published in the university's literary journal?" He'd announce proudly at a neighborhood barbecue, trying to hand my dad a copy of the journal. My father would take it, glance at the cover, and clap Marcus on the shoulder with a warm, booming laugh. "That's great, son. Really great. A real wordsmith. Hey, have you seen Sam? I want him to meet Bill Henderson from the country club. Bill's son plays for Stanford, and I think they could exchange some pointers." And just like that, the journal would be placed on a side table, forgotten, and the spotlight would swing back to where it always belonged. It wasn't until I left for college that I realized the world was bigger than my family's suffocating orbit. I found my people, my tribe. Eliza, a brutally honest photography major who saw the world in stark, beautiful contrasts. Devin, a philosophy student who would stay up with me until 3 a.m. debating the meaning of a single sentence. And then there was Professor Sophia, my creative writing mentor. She was the first authority figure in my life who looked at my work and saw not a diversion, but a destination. You have a voice, Alex, she told me after reading one of my stories. Her words feeling like a balm on years of silent wounds. Don't you ever let anyone, and I mean anyone, convince you to silence it. They were the family I was starting to choose for myself. And then, in graduate school, the universe finally gave me Julian. Julian was an architecture student, a man who saw beauty in structure and function, but also in the beautiful chaos of art. He came from a loud, warm, sprawling Hispanic family where emotions weren't a sign of weakness. They were the main event. The first time I had dinner at his parents' house in Arizona, his mother, Elena, a tiny woman with a hug that could heal fractures, pulled me into the kitchen and insisted I taste the sauce she was making. His father, Roberto, a big man with a bigger laugh, spent a solid 20 minutes asking me about the themes in my thesis. They looked me in the eye when I spoke. They asked follow-up questions. In a single evening, they made me feel more seen and valued than my own parents had in my entire life. Julian became my anchor. He didn't just tolerate my passion, he championed it. When I got my first poem published in a national magazine, he had it professionally framed and hung it over our fireplace. A masterpiece, he declared, kissing me soundly. The first of many. When we moved into our first apartment, a cramped one-bedroom that was all we could afford, he spent a weekend building me a writing nook in a corner of the living room. It was my sacred space. He was there, holding my hand, through every excruciatingly polite family dinner where my accomplishments were ignored. He was there through every Christmas where my gift was a generic gift card, while Sam received a new set of expensive golf clubs. He saw the subtle barbs, the dismissive gestures, the vacant looks. He saw it all, and he loved me not in spite of my wounds, but with a deep understanding of them. So when I got down on one knee during a trip to a writers' conference in New England, surrounded by books and people who loved them, his tearful, joyful yes felt like the beginning of my real life. His family exploded with happiness. His mother, Elena, started a group chat to plan their trip for the wedding within minutes. My announcement to my own family was met with a familiar, chilly silence. I called my mother first. "Oh," she said, her voice flat with surprise. "Well, that's certainly soon. Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Mom." "Well, all right then. Just try not to be too emotional about it all." I told my father that evening. He was on his tablet, scrolling through stock market reports. He didn't look up. "Good for you, son," he muttered. "Hope you know what you're doing." A few days later, I got a one-word text from Sam, "Congrats." The disappointment was a familiar ache, but this time, it was different, because this time I had Julian. I had my friends. I had a life that was vibrant and full, waiting for me outside their cold shadow. I discussed it with my therapist, Dr. Wong, a wonderfully wise woman who had been helping me untangle the complicated knots of my upbringing. "Alex," she said, her voice both gentle and firm, "you are still watering a plant that has never borne fruit for you. You keep expecting them to react like the parents you deserve, not the parents they have consistently shown themselves to be. Your task now is not to change them. It is to protect your own joy." Her words became my mantra. Protect your joy. We planned a wedding that was a perfect reflection of us. It was held at a restored historic library, a place that honored my love for words and Julian's for beautiful, timeless structures. We invited our chosen family, the people who had shown up for us time and time again, and we sent formal, engraved invitations to my parents. We even arranged a car service to make it as easy as possible for them. I called my mother a week before the wedding, my heart doing a nervous flutter despite myself. "Just wanted to confirm you guys are all set for Saturday," I said, trying to sound casual. "We'll see, Alex," she'd replied in that vague, non-committal tone that I knew was a death knell to any hope. "It's a very busy time for your father." In my final session with Dr. Wong before the big day, she gave me one last piece of advice. "You cannot control if they show up, Alex, but you can control how much space their absence occupies in your mind. Reserve their seats as a courtesy, but do not, under any circumstances, reserve your happiness." That belongs to you and Julian alone." I held onto those words like a shield as I prepared to walk down the aisle. I was ready to protect my joy. I thought I was prepared for the sting of their absence. I was not prepared for the calculated cruelty of their choice. The day of my wedding was, against all odds, perfect. It was the kind of day screenwriters invent. The late autumn sun, low and golden, streamed through the tall, arched windows of the old library, bathing the entire room in a soft, ethereal glow. The scent of old books and fresh flowers mingled in the air. Julian was waiting for me at the altar, and the look on his face, a breathtaking mix of love, awe, and pure, unadulterated happiness, was enough to make the rest of the world and all its complications simply melt away. My college mentor, Professor Sophia, a woman who had become more of a mother to me than my own, walked me down the aisle. When I'd asked her, her eyes had filled with tears and she'd whispered that it would be one of the greatest honors of her life. As we walked, I looked out at the faces of our guests, our friends who had flown in from all corners of the country. Julian's sprawling, boisterous family, who took up 3 whole rows and radiated enough warmth to heat the entire building. It was a fortress of love and acceptance, built brick by brick over years of genuine connection. But my eyes, against my will, kept drifting to the 2 empty chairs in the front row. They were upholstered in a rich, dark velvet, and they sat there like a void, a small black hole threatening to suck all the light and joy out of the room. I felt a familiar pang, the old ache of the boy with the certificate in the drawer. But then I looked at Julian, and he gave me a small, reassuring nod. I squeezed his hand, anchoring myself to his presence, and I let it go. I was protecting my joy. They would not ruin this. And for a while they didn't. The ceremony was intimate and profoundly personal. We had Eliza read a poem by Mary Oliver. We read vows we'd written ourselves, promises that were not flowery or generic, but were forged in the reality of our life together. Julian's voice cracked when he promised to always be my champion, and I felt a wave of love so powerful it almost buckled my knees. This was real. This was my family. The reception that followed was a blur of laughter, champagne, and heartfelt toasts. Our first dance was to a beautiful, melancholic piece of music a composer friend had secretly written, inspired by one of my short stories. Julian had arranged it as a wedding gift. As he held me, spinning me around the dance floor under the warm lights, I was surrounded by so much genuine affection that the 2 empty chairs and the people who were supposed to be in them began to fade into the background. I was finally allowing myself to believe it. I was happy, truly, completely happy. Then, just as the band was kicking into a more upbeat set, Marcus came up to me. He was my best man, my friend since kindergarten, the one person who had been a constant witness to my entire life story. His face was unusually tight, his jaw clenched in a way I recognized as him trying to control his anger. "Alex, man, I don't know if I should show you this right now," he said, his voice low and tense. "Show me what? What's wrong?" My heart started to beat a little faster. He hesitated, his eyes full of conflict. "Maybe it can wait." "No, just show me," I insisted. With a heavy sigh, he handed me his phone. And that's when the beautiful, perfect day shattered into a million tiny pieces. The screen was open to Instagram. It was Sam's account. He had posted a new story just an hour earlier. It wasn't a picture. It was a video, a sweeping panoramic shot of my parents' immaculate backyard. My father was standing at their massive stainless steel grill, wearing a Kiss the Cook apron, laughing as he held up a pair of tongs for the camera. My mother was sitting at a patio table with a group of her friends, her social committee, raising a glass of white wine in a toast. And there, trotting happily through the middle of the frame, was our family's aging golden retriever, Gus, wearing a ridiculous, cone-shaped party hat. Then came the caption, typed out in a cheerful, carefree font at the bottom of the screen. "Family time is the best time. #blessed." I stared at the phone, the sound of the party around me fading into a dull roar. My heart, which had been so full and light just moments before, felt like it had been scooped out with a rusty spoon. They hadn't just missed my wedding. They hadn't just been too busy. They had actively chosen this. They had chosen a backyard barbecue over witnessing the most important moment of their son's life. And then they had celebrated that choice, documented it, and broadcast it to the world with a hashtag. Hashtag blessed. A wave of nausea washed over me. Something inside me didn't just crack. It disintegrated. I handed the phone back to Marcus, my own hands feeling numb and disconnected from my body. I couldn't form words. I turned on my heel and walked, almost blindly, through the crowd and out onto the cool stone terrace, gasping for air that didn't feel tainted with betrayal. Julian was right behind me. He didn't ask what was wrong. He had seen the look on my face. He just wrapped his strong arms around my shoulders and held me. "They're the ones who missed out, my love," he said softly, his voice thick with a fierce, protective anger that I was too numb to feel myself. "They missed seeing how handsome you look. They missed hearing your vows. They missed this." I knew he was right. I knew it on an intellectual level. But my heart was telling a different story. It wasn't about what they had missed. It was about what they had done. It was the casual, public cruelty of it all. The party hat on the dog. That was the detail that lodged in my brain like a shard of glass. They had taken the time to find and put a stupid party hat on a dog, but they couldn't be bothered to get in a car and drive 2 hours to see their son get married. I didn't cry. All those years of being labeled the sensitive one had taught me how to build dams to hold back the floods of emotion. But this was a tsunami. I just stood there, leaning heavily on my new husband, watching the sun set on the happiest and, in some ways, the most devastatingly painful day of my life. That night, long after the last guest had departed and we were alone in the quiet of our hotel suite, the adrenaline finally wore off, leaving behind a hollow core of grief and a cold, hard knot of anger. I looked at Julian, this incredible, loving man who had just promised to stand by me through everything, and I made a new promise to myself. "They don't get to do this to me anymore," I said, my voice hoarse but clear. "They don't get to be a part of this, of us. Not unless they earn it. The door is closed." Julian came over and kissed my forehead, his touch gentle and grounding. "I'm with you," he said, his conviction absolute. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you always." Weeks crawled by. The silence from my family was a heavy, suffocating blanket. No call, no text, no card. It was as if my wedding, and by extension, I, had been neatly and efficiently erased. The hurt slowly began to cool, hardening day by day into a quiet, unshakable resolve. 2 months after the wedding, I drove to their house. I went alone. Julian had offered to come, his protective instincts on high alert, but this was a journey I had to make by myself. It wasn't about seeking forgiveness or starting a fight. It was about closure. I needed to stand in front of them and make them look at the wound they had inflicted. I was still naive enough to believe that if they just saw it, they would have to acknowledge it. That brings us back to that moment in the living room. The moment I asked that simple, devastating question, "Why?" And now you know the full context behind their response. The casual mention of a barbecue, the condescending smirk, the dismissive chuckle, the gutting line about a real family. They weren't just indifferent. They were contemptuous. They looked at my pain, the pain they had so carelessly caused, and they laughed. As I stood in their doorway, ready to leave for what I instinctively knew would be the last time in a very, very long time, I felt a strange and unexpected sense of peace settle over me. The central, agonizing question of my life, was I good enough for them, had finally, irrevocably, been answered. No, and I would never, ever have to ask it again. As I walked to my car, my steps feeling lighter than they had in years, Sam pulled into the driveway in his sleek, black BMW. He got out and we stood there for a moment in a triangle of awkward silence. He, the golden child, the reason for the barbecue. Me, the outcast, the reason for this final confrontation. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the easy, unbothered confidence he wore like a second skin. He gave me a curt, dismissive nod. I gave him one back, and I got in my car and drove away, the rearview mirror showing my childhood home, the museum of my inadequacies, shrinking until it was just a tiny, insignificant speck in the distance. It was over. The hoping was over. The trying was over. A new chapter had begun. The chapter of silence. The year that followed my final visit home was one of the most transformative periods of my entire life. It was a year defined by a profound silence from my family, but my own world had never felt louder or more vibrant. It was as if, by finally cutting off the constant, low-grade hum of seeking their approval, I had freed up an immense amount of energy. And I poured all of that reclaimed power into my work and, most importantly, into my marriage. Julian and I focused on building a life that was quiet and strong and entirely our own. We found and bought our first house, a charming 1920s craftsman with a big, neglected backyard and enough room for a real garden. I remember the day we got the keys. We walked through the empty rooms, our footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, and I felt a sense of ownership that was completely new to me. This was ours. We spent weekends painting walls, stripping old wallpaper, and slowly breathing life back into the place. On our first wedding anniversary, Julian led me out to the detached garage, his eyes sparkling with a secret. He'd spent weeks, with the help of his father, converting it into a writing studio for me. It had a big, sturdy desk facing a window that looked out onto the garden we were slowly cultivating. He'd built bookshelves that covered an entire wall. It was a space that was unequivocally mine, a room that honored the part of me my parents had always dismissed as a hobby. It was the most thoughtful, profound gift I'd ever received. It was a physical manifestation of his belief in me. My career, nourished by this newfound peace and focus, began to take off in a way I'd only dared to dream of. I finally finished the collection of short stories I'd been wrestling with for years. Freed from the invisible critic in my head, the writing was sharper, more honest. My editor, Gabrielle, a sharp, no-nonsense woman from a major publishing house in New York, called me the day after I submitted the manuscript. I was expecting weeks of waiting. "Alex," she said, her voice crackling with an energy that sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. "Stop whatever you're doing. This is it. This is the one. It's honest, it's raw, and it's brilliant. We're fast-tracking it for the fall list." Hearing those words from her, a woman whose opinion carried real weight in the literary world, was a form of validation so pure and powerful it made the concept of my father's approval seem laughably insignificant. This was real. This was earned. This was mine. All the while, the silence from my family remained absolute. They didn't call for my birthday. Julian and I spent it hiking in Yosemite. They didn't call on Christmas. We spent the holidays with his family in Arizona, where I was welcomed with boisterous hugs, incredible food, and treated not like an in-law, but like a son. It was a glimpse into a world I never knew could exist. Then, about 8 months into that year of silence, our peaceful world was shaken. Julian came down with a sudden, severe abdominal pain that had him doubled over. We rushed to the emergency room, and after hours of tests, the diagnosis came back: appendicitis and a particularly nasty case. It required emergency surgery. For 3 days, I barely left his hospital bedside. It was terrifying, seeing the strongest, most capable person I knew so pale and vulnerable, hooked up to machines. My chosen family rallied. Eliza brought food. Marcus sat with me for hours in the waiting room, just so I wouldn't be alone. Julian's parents flew in from Arizona and insisted on taking shifts with me. One afternoon, while Julian was sleeping, Marcus and I were grabbing coffee in the hospital cafeteria. "Do they know?" I asked him, not needing to specify who they were. Marcus nodded, his expression grim. He looked uncomfortable. "My dad had to call your dad for an insurance question, some old policy thing. He mentioned Julian was in the hospital. So, yeah, they know." The knowledge landed like a stone in my gut. They knew my husband was in the hospital, that he'd had emergency surgery, and they chose to do nothing. The phone never rang. Not a single text. Not an email asking if he was okay. It was a new level of coldness, a confirmation that I had made the right decision. They hadn't just cut me out. They had cut out the person I loved most in the world. Their silence was no longer passive. It was an active, deliberate act of cruelty. When my book was published that fall, it was met with reviews I could have only dreamed of. My friends, my real family, threw a surprise party for me at our favorite local restaurant. Eliza, my fierce photographer friend, raised a glass of champagne. To chosen family, she toasted, her eyes shining with pride. The ones who show up in good times and in bad. As our glasses clinked together, the sound was so full and resonant, so different from the hollow, mocking clink of my father's glass when he'd laughed at my pain. This was the sound of real connection. This was the sound of home. Life was good. It was full and rich and real. I had everything I needed. But I knew, deep down, with a certainty that was unsettling, that this was just the eye of the storm. This was the quiet center. And sooner or later, the other side of the hurricane, the part one couldn't even imagine, was bound to hit land. It arrived on a cold, gray Tuesday morning in January, almost a year and a half after my wedding. The call wasn't from my mother or from Sam. It was from my father, Richard. And his voice was unervingly different. The usual booming, dismissive confidence was gone, replaced by something I'd never heard from him before. A smooth, rehearsed, almost syrupy friendliness. It set off every single alarm bell in my head. Alex, son. Just the man I was hoping to catch. How have you been? He started. The word son. Feeling so foreign and manipulative on his tongue, it was almost comical. I'm fine, Dad, I said, my voice cool. I wasn't interested in playing games. What's this about? He launched into a long, rambling story about his company. They were in the middle of a delicate merger with a larger corporation. There was a lot of scrutiny. Legacy, he kept saying, was on his mind. He talked about the Mitchell family name, about public perception, about the importance of image. I listened, my grip tightening on my phone, just waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then, with the practiced ease of a master manipulator, he dropped it. Listen, there's a big feature piece being planned, he said, his voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial tone. A major business magazine. They want to do a story on our family, a multi-generational legacy piece. And they think it would be a fantastic angle to include you, the successful author's son. A modern family, you know? Paints the right picture. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine, a feeling I hadn't felt since I was a child. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was asking me to be a prop. He wanted to use my success, the very thing he had always belittled and dismissed, to burnish his own image for a business deal. Then he delivered the final, calculated blow, the one he had saved for last. It would mean a lot to your mother, too, he said quietly, the fake friendliness replaced by a somber tone. She's not been well, Alex. Not at all. What do you mean, she's not well? I asked, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. The cold dread I'd felt was rapidly turning into a solid block of ice in my stomach. This was a calculated move. I could feel it. It's cancer, he said. He delivered the word with the same emotional detachment he might use to report a disappointing quarterly earning. There was no tremor in his voice, no hint of a husband's grief. It was just a fact, a piece of data to be deployed. Ovarian. Stage 2. The treatments are tough, as you can imagine. A little bit of good news, a nice, positive family piece like this. Well, it would do her a world of good right now. There it was. The 1-2 punch, perfectly executed. He had laid his cards on the table with sickening precision. My mother's illness wasn't a tragedy to be shared with a son. It was a tool. It was the emotional blackmail designed to pin me to the wall, leaving me no room to maneuver. Do this for your sick mother. How could you say no? I don't remember what I said to end the call. I think I just mumbled something about needing to think and hung up. I stood in my sun-filled writing studio, surrounded by the life I had built, and felt a chill so deep it seemed to settle in my bones. Cancer. The word was a battering ram, smashing against the carefully constructed walls of my new life. My mother was sick, and my father, my own father, was using her illness as a bargaining chip in a corporate game. That night, I told Julian everything. I laid it all out on our kitchen table, next to the mail and a vase of flowers he'd brought home. I watched his face shift through a kaleidoscope of emotions. First confusion, then anger on my behalf, and finally, a deep, compassionate sorrow. Julian, whose own mother was the undisputed, loving heart of their family, couldn't begin to compute this level of cold-blooded calculation. "It's just one interview, though, right?" he said after a long silence. He was struggling to find a solution to fix the unfixable because that's who he is. He's a builder. He saw a broken thing and his first instinct was to mend it. Maybe this is the opening, Alex? A chance to see her? You could do the interview and then you'd be back in their lives, you could be there for her. His words, spoken with such genuine, loving intent, felt like a small betrayal. It wasn't his fault. He couldn't possibly understand. His blueprint for family was love, support, and showing up. My blueprint was neglect, transaction, and manipulation. "And then what, Jules?" I asked, and the frustration in my voice was sharper than I intended. "And then everything goes back to the way it was? I perform for him, I give him the soundbite he needs for his merger, and then they go back to treating us like we don't exist? This isn't an olive branch. It's a leash. He's trying to put a leash back on me." For the first time in our relationship, I saw a flicker of incomprehension in his eyes. He loved me, but he couldn't fully grasp the depth of this particular darkness. And in that moment, I felt a profound sense of loneliness. Even the person who knew me best, who had stood by me through everything, couldn't walk this last, final part of the road with me. This was a decision I had to make entirely on my own, in the cold, stark reality of my own history. "He's not asking for my time," I explained, my voice softening as I saw the hurt look on his face. "He's asking for my credibility. He's asking for a piece of my soul. The one thing I built for myself without a single ounce of his help. He wants to borrow my light to shine on himself, and he's using my mother's illness to do it. I can't. I just can't." Seeing the raw pain in my eyes, Julian closed the distance between us and pulled me into a hug, his arms a familiar, safe harbor. "You're right," he whispered into my hair, his own conflict dissolving in the face of my certainty. "I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. Whatever you do, I support you 100%. His support was my bedrock, but I knew the final step was mine, and mine alone. I let a full day pass. I let my father's request and my mother's diagnosis wage war inside me. Guilt was a powerful soldier. The image of my mother, sick and weak, made my stomach clench. But then I would remember. I would remember the boy with the certificate stuffed in a drawer. I would remember the 2 empty chairs at my wedding. I would remember the deafening silence when my husband was in the hospital. I wasn't just weighing a single request. I was weighing the entire, crushing history of my life with them. The next afternoon, I picked up the phone and called him. He answered on the first ring, his voice brimming with a confidence that told me he thought he'd already won. "Alex, good man. I'm glad you came to your senses." His arrogance was the final clarifying force I needed. The last flicker of doubt I had, the last shred of guilt that was clinging to me, was instantly extinguished by the sheer, unadulterated entitlement in his voice. I took a deep breath, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. "I've been thinking about your proposal, Dad. It's not a proposal, it's a fantastic opportunity for all of us." He corrected me, his tone condescending. "Right?" I said, my voice dangerously calm. "But before I give you my answer, I just have one question for you. Why should I?" There was a stunned pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears in his brain grinding to a halt, trying to process a question he had never in his life had to consider. I had never questioned his authority before. I had only ever obeyed or retreated into silence. What do you mean, why should you?" he finally sputtered, his voice losing its smooth, practiced edge. "What kind of a ridiculous question is that?" "It's a very simple question," I pressed, feeling a surge of power I'd never felt before. "You are asking me to stand next to you and smile for a camera and pretend that we are the portrait of a happy, successful American family. You're asking me to lend my name, the name I made for myself, to your corporate legacy. I am simply asking you to give me one single, compelling reason why I should do that for you." The silence that followed was thick with his indignation. I had flipped the board. For my entire life, I had been the one auditioning for his approval, trying to justify my own existence. Now, he was the one who had to justify his request to me. And he had nothing. Finally, his real voice came through. Not the smooth negotiator, not the distant patriarch, but the raw, angry tyrant that had always lived just beneath the surface. "Because it is your duty," he roared, his voice cracking with disbelief that he was even having to have this conversation. "Because you are my son, after everything we have given you. The house you grew up in, the education we paid for, the food on your table." I cut him off. And the voice that came out of my own mouth was not the voice of a boy. It was the voice of a man who had finally, completely, and irrevocably run out of patience. "Let me tell you what you gave me, Dad," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "You gave me a childhood of feeling invisible in my own home. You gave me a brother who was a son and a life where I was his shadow. You laughed at my deepest pain on the day I should have been the happiest. The only thing you ever truly gave me was the raw material to write my first book. My credibility is my own. My success is my own. My life is my own." I paused, letting the words hang in the dead air between us. I could hear his ragged, furious breathing on the other end of the line. "So no," I said, delivering the final quiet blow. "The answer is no. Not now. Not ever." And I hung up the phone. I stood there in the absolute quiet of my writing studio, the phone still clutched in my hand. The air felt different, felt lighter. A 30-year-old chain, a chain I had only just realized I was wearing, had been shattered. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about anger anymore. It was about clarity. It was the breathtaking, terrifying, liberating clarity of standing on my own 2 feet, entirely and forever free from the weight of their expectations. I was finally, truly on my own, and I had never felt stronger. The silence that followed that final phone call was a completely different species from the silences that had come before. It wasn't the heavy, neglectful silence of their indifference. It was the clean, resonant silence of a severed connection, the final, definitive click of a door being locked for good. For a few days, I existed in that quiet space, feeling the echoes of that monumental conversation fade. I had done it. I had said the unsayable. I had stood up to the man whose shadow had loomed over every single aspect of my life, and I had not flinched. Julian watched me with a quiet, observant concern, ready to catch me if I stumbled, but I didn't stumble. I felt solid. For the first time in my 38 years, I felt like the foundation of my own life was built on solid rock, not on the shifting, treacherous sands of their approval. It was a strange and powerful sensation. The first ripple from the stone I had thrown into their placid pond reached me about a week later. My phone rang, and the caller ID showed Sam's name. A knot of apprehension tightened in my stomach. I took a deep breath and answered, steeling myself for what was to come. I expected anger. I expected accusations. I expected him to be his father's messenger. I was not prepared for the voice that greeted me. It wasn't the confident, easygoing drawl of the golden child. It was the frayed, panicked voice of someone who was completely out of his depth. "Alex, what did you do?" he started, the words tumbling out in a disorganized, frantic rush. "Dad is going absolutely insane. He's like a caged animal. The merger is getting rocky, he's blaming you for it, he says you deliberately sabotaged him. Mom is a complete wreck. She won't stop crying. Why did you do that? Why couldn't you just do the one thing he asked? It was just a stupid photo. Why do you always have to make everything so damn difficult?" The torrent of accusations, the sheer, breathtaking unfairness of it all, should have made my blood boil. But it didn't. As I listened to him, all I felt was a profound, weary sadness. He still didn't get it. He couldn't. He had spent his entire life as the sun in their solar system, the solution to every problem, the embodiment of their pride. He was so embedded in their toxic system that he couldn't comprehend my refusal to be a part of it any longer. To him, my boundary was an act of aggression. I let him finish his tirade, let him completely run out of steam. When he was done, there was just his heavy, ragged breathing on the line. "Sam," I said, and my voice was surprisingly gentle, like I was talking to a child who had just woken up from a nightmare. "Did you ever, for 1 second, stop to think why I might have had to get so strong in the first place?" Complete silence. The kind of silence that is so loud it rings in your ears. It was a question I knew with absolute certainty that he had no answer for. It was a question that had probably never even occurred to him in his entire life. He had always benefited from the family dynamic, from the imbalance of power. Why would he ever question the foundation of his own throne? "He asked me to lie for him, Sam," I continued, my voice low and steady. "He asked me to use my life, my husband, and my career as a marketing tool for his business deal, and he used our mother's illness as the gun to my head to make me do it. That's not a family, Sam. That's a hostage situation. I am truly sorry that you are in the middle of it. I'm sorry that you have to deal with the fallout. But I am not the one who made things difficult. I'm just the one who finally refused to keep playing the game." He didn't know what to say. I could hear him take a shaky, uncertain breath. I have to go," he mumbled, and the line went dead. That conversation was a turning point, though I didn't realize its full significance at the time. I had just handed my brother a mirror that I had been forced to look into for decades. For the first time, he was being forced to see our family not from his privileged, sun-drenched position, but from my place in the shadows. The reflection was not a pretty one, and I knew, instinctively, that he would not be able to look away. A few weeks later, Marcus called me. We had a standing weekly phone call, a small ritual of connection that had kept me sane for years. "Hey, just thought you might find this interesting," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Word around the country club is that Richard Mitchell's big merger with Omnicorp went south. Apparently, some pretty unflattering stories about his my way or the highway management style came out during the due diligence process. The other company got spooked and pulled out. He's taking a massive hit, professionally and financially." I felt a quiet, somber sense of satisfaction. It wasn't joy. It was the feeling of watching a law of physics prove itself to be true. Actions have consequences. My refusal to participate in the PR stunt didn't cause his downfall, but my participation might have saved him from it. By simply stepping away, by refusing to be the final, gleaming piece of his facade, I had allowed reality to run its inevitable course. I didn't hear from Sam again for a very, very long time. The silence returned, but this time it was peaceful. It was the silence of a battle won, of a border finally and definitively secured. My life with Julian continued its forward momentum. We worked in the garden, turning the dry, neglected soil into something that could sustain life. I started outlining my second book, the words coming more easily now, unburdened by the weight of the past. I was moving forward. The storm had passed, the hurricane had moved out to sea, and I was left standing, a little battered and bruised, but for the first time in my life, completely and utterly whole. The real work, the work of rebuilding on cleared ground, could finally begin. 2 years passed. 2 years of quiet, steady, forward motion, like a river finally finding its natural course after a dam has been removed. My life wasn't a highlight reel of dramatic victories or grand pronouncements. It was a collection of small, meaningful, everyday moments that, when stitched together, created a tapestry of profound and lasting peace. My second book was published. It didn't make the earth-shattering splash that the first one had, the one born from so much pain. This one was quieter, more contemplative. It received solid, respectful reviews that spoke of my growth as a writer. It cemented my place as a serious artist, not just a one-hit wonder with a tragic backstory. And that felt right. My life was quieter now. My sense of validation no longer came from bestseller lists or glowing reviews from strangers. It came from the deep, intrinsic satisfaction of the work itself, from the quiet hum of contentment in the home Julian and I had so carefully and lovingly built. We filled that home with life. We adopted a scruffy, perpetually optimistic terrier mix from a local shelter and named him Leo. His happy, clicking paws on the hardwood floors became the new soundtrack to our mornings. And we began the long, arduous, but hopeful process of adoption. We wanted to build a family on a foundation of conscious choice and unconditional love, to give a child the kind of safety and absolute acceptance that we cherished so deeply in each other. The silence from my parents remained unbroken. It was no longer a presence in my life. It was simply an absence, like a phantom limb that had long since stopped aching. I learned through the thinnest of grapevines, a brief, awkward conversation with a cousin at a mutual friend's wedding, a stray remark from Marcus, that my mother's health had stabilized. The cancer was in remission. I was genuinely relieved to hear it. A distant, detached kind of relief, the way you'd feel hearing good news about a stranger. I also heard that my father had been forced into an early, unceremonious retirement. The Omnicorp deal had fallen apart so spectacularly that it had taken his reputation down with it. They had sold the big, ostentatious house I grew up in and moved to a smaller, more modest condo a few towns over. Their world had irrevocably shrunk, a direct consequence of the implosion of my father's carefully curated image. It wasn't a victory for me. It was just a fact. It was the final chapter of a story I was no longer reading. The real shift, the one I truly never saw coming, came from Sam. After that panicked, angry phone call 2 years prior, he had vanished from my life. I had assumed, with a sense of resignation, that he had chosen his side. I pictured him doubling down on his role as the dutiful son, now more important to them than ever in their diminished world. Then, one crisp Saturday afternoon in the fall, the doorbell rang. I was in the kitchen, trying to perfect one of Elena's recipes. I opened the door to find Sam standing on my porch, alone. He looked older, and the easy, golden boy confidence that had always been his armor was gone, replaced by a deep-seated weariness that resided in his eyes. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit or designer jeans. He was in a simple gray sweater and worn-in work boots. He looked normal, human. "Hey, Alex," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. He was holding a small potted plant, a young Japanese maple with delicate, crimson leaves. I was so surprised that I couldn't speak for a moment. I just stared at him. "Sam, what are you doing here?" "I was in the area," he said, which we both knew was a lie. "I was hoping. Is it okay if I come in for a minute?" I stepped aside and let him into our home. He stood awkwardly in the entryway for a moment, his eyes taking in everything. The framed photos of me and Julian on our travels, the bookshelves that were overflowing with books, the general lived-in, comfortable warmth of the space. It was a world away from the sterile, formal, look-but-don't-touch living room of our childhood. I brought you this," he said, holding out the small tree. "For your garden. I know you guys like to garden." "Thank you," I said, taking it from him. The gesture was so unexpected, so thoughtful, that I didn't know how to react. We ended up out back in the garden. I showed him the writing studio Julian had built for me. He stepped inside and ran his hand along the smooth, worn wood of my desk. "This is really nice, Alex," he said, his voice filled with a genuine appreciation that caught me off guard. We didn't talk about our parents. We didn't talk about the past. We just existed in the same space for the first time in our adult lives without the suffocating weight of their expectations between us. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, he turned to me. He was holding his car keys, turning them over and over in his hand, the metal clicking softly. "I've been going to therapy, Alex," he said, his gaze fixed on the ground. "For about a year now. I had a lot of stuff, a lot of things to unpack." He finally summoned the courage to meet my eyes. "I was a coward," he said, and his voice was thick with an emotion I had never, ever heard from him before. It was a raw, unfiltered shame. "My whole life, Alex, I just did what they wanted. It was easier that way. I got the praise, the attention. It was like a drug. And I knew. Deep down, I always knew what they did to you was wrong. At your wedding, I knew it was wrong. I saw the picture before I posted it. But I did it anyway, because I was scared. I was terrified of them ever looking at me the way they looked at you. He took a deep, shaky breath, the confession costing him dearly. Then you said no to Dad. You refused to play the game. You blew up the whole damn thing. And for the first time I was forced to see it all for what it really was. And I had to see myself for who I was in all of it. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled something out. It was a copy of my first book. It was battered, the cover creased and folded back on itself, the corners soft and frayed from being read and reread multiple times. I've read this book 5 times, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I finally get it. I am so sorry, Alex, for everything, for being a bad brother. Tears were welling in his eyes, and they were real. And in that moment, for the first time, I saw not the golden child, not the rival, not the symbol of my otherness. I saw my brother, a man who had been just as trapped in his own gilded cage as I had been in my invisible one. I didn't have a grand speech of forgiveness. There was no dramatic, cinematic moment of reconciliation. I just put a hand on his shoulder, a simple human gesture of connection. Thank you for telling me that, Sam, I said, and I meant it. It wasn't a resolution. It was a beginning, a fragile, tentative, but very real beginning. We didn't magically become best friends overnight, but we started slowly to become brothers. He would call and we would talk about books, about work, about the challenges of trying to be a good man in a complicated world. He came over for dinner and met our beautiful daughter, Sophia, after we finally brought her home from the agency. He was quiet and gentle and almost reverent with her. And in his eyes, I saw a man who was actively trying to build something new and better out of the wreckage of our shared past. It's a funny thing about life. You spend so long fighting a war that you think will define your entire existence. And then one day you look up from the battlefield and realize the war has been over for a long time, and you're just a man standing in a quiet garden at sunset. My life today is nothing like I ever thought it would be when I was younger. It's smaller in scope, but infinitely larger in depth. It's quieter, but so much more joyful. My world, my real world, revolves around the rich smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of my husband's easy laughter echoing from the other room, and the feel of my daughter's small, trusting hand in mine. This morning, Sophia and I were out in the backyard. She's 4 now, a whirlwind of boundless energy, muddy knees, and impossibly profound questions. We were finally planting the Japanese maple that Sam brought over all that time ago. It had outgrown its temporary pot and was ready for a permanent home in our soil. As I dug my hands into the rich, dark earth, I watched her carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration, as she helped me guide the little tree into the hole we'd made. She patted the soil around its base with her tiny hands, then looked up at me, her face smudged with dirt and utterly serious. "Is it happy here, Daddy?" she asked. I smiled, a real, bone-deep smile that reached all the way up to my eyes. "I think so, sweetheart. It's got good soil here. It'll grow up to be big and strong." And in that simple, perfect moment, it all clicked into place. All those years, I had been a plant desperately trying to grow in poisoned soil. I had been begging for water and sunlight from people who lived in a perpetual self-imposed shade. My great liberation wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting a final, satisfying apology. It was the simple, profound, life-altering realization that I didn't have to stay planted there. I had the power to uproot myself and find my own patch of earth. My peace today doesn't depend on my parents ever understanding the depth of what they lost. It doesn't require their remorse or their acknowledgement. My peace comes from knowing that I had the strength to walk away from a place where I could not thrive, and the courage to build a garden of my own. Family, I've finally learned, isn't about the blood you share. It's about the people who show up. It's about the people who water your roots when you're wilting and who celebrate your blossoms when you finally, against all odds, bloom. It's the family you choose, the family you build, the family you protect with every fiber of your being. I look at my life now, my incredible husband, my beautiful daughter, my brother who is slowly and painstakingly finding his way back to me, my friends who are my anchors in the storm, and I know with a certainty that settles deep in my soul that I am the wealthiest man in the world. My life isn't a story of what was taken from me anymore. It's a story of what I had the courage to build in its place. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it resonated with you in some way. Have you ever had to make the difficult choice to walk away to protect your own peace? I'd be honored if you'd share your story in the comments below. I read them all. And if this meant something to you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about finding your own way.